Your mother never understood money. She never understood anything that mattered. He said it the way you might note a minor inconvenience. Flat, unhurried, aimed at our son across the dinner table while Raymond's hand was already moving toward the breadbasket, while the wine was being refilled and the roast cooled in the center of the table. He did not look at me. Marcus did not look at me. Someone else reached for the salt. The conversation kept moving with the easy, oblivious current of people who have no reason to believe anything is about to change. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, with $63,000 in missing joint savings pressing like a stone in the middle of my chest, money I was not supposed to know about yet, and I smiled. I passed the bread. I am 74 years old. That was the last night I would ever pass Raymond anything. If those two sentences just landed somewhere specific in your body, if you have ever sat at a table and been made invisible in front of the people who were supposed to love you most, I need you to share this story with someone who needs it right now. Because what I did in the hours after that dinner changed everything, and I think someone close to you has been waiting a long time to hear exactly what I am about to say. But to understand what I did, you need to understand what came before it. And it started 40 minutes before that dinner, in my parked car in Marcus's driveway with the engine off. I had been sitting there for 21 minutes. I know this exactly because I watched the dashboard clock tick from 8:41 p.m. to 9:02 p.m. without making a single movement. It is spring in Baltimore, the season when the windows finally open and life starts to feel possible again. The air coming through the small crack I had left in my window smelled like cut grass and someone's barbecue drifting from a few houses down the block. Baltimore does spring differently than most cities. There is something soft and forgiving about the way the old neighborhoods exhale after winter. The way the light softens over brick facades and makes everything look briefly as if it was built with intention. I could smell all of it that evening. I could not feel any of it. My hands were cold in my lap. I am 74 years old, and I have lived most of my adult life in this city. Baltimore is in me at the level of bone. The marble stoops in the historic neighborhoods, the sound of screen doors on summer evenings, the late afternoon copper light on the old row houses, the way certain blocks smell of something permanent and lived in that no other city quite replicates. I know these streets by instinct and by memory and by the weight of everything that has happened in them over 7 decades. But for the last 3 years, my life has been lived in a senior living studio, with a kitchenette and a shared hallway on a quiet suburban street, lined with modest homes and chain-link fences. The kind of neighborhood where the rhythms are steady and dependable. Dogs walked before 7 in the morning, school buses arriving and departing like clockwork. Older men in lawn chairs on Saturday afternoons, with the dignified stillness of people who have finished needing to prove anything to anyone. It was modest. It was mine. I had believed, with the careful, specific faith of a woman who has learned to hold what she has with both hands, that it was truly mine. My golden mustard sweater, the color of late October, of something rich and harvested and solid, was already twisted at the waist where I had been gripping it without noticing. I always do this. My hands work out what my mind refuses to acknowledge. Just inside my front door, mounted on the wall, there is a rotary phone, the heavy handset kind, with a dial that clicks satisfyingly when you spin it, and a ring that belongs to another century entirely. Raymond had been telling me to remove it for years, called it an embarrassment, said it made the place look stuck in the past, and he said it with the patient, gently correcting tone he used for the many aspects of my life he had decided needed updating. Never cruelly, always helpfully, the way someone points out a piece of spinach in your teeth. I kept the phone because my mother had installed one just like it in her kitchen, and as a girl I would stand on a step stool to reach the receiver and feel like the entire world was accessible to me. It still worked perfectly. Of all the things Raymond had encouraged me to surrender over 5 decades, this was one of the very few I had refused outright. I want you to hold that phone in your mind. It becomes more important than it appears to right now. I walked into Marcus's house at 9 o'clock, I sat down at the dinner table. I accepted wine I did not drink. And Raymond looked across at our son and said the words that were either the most ordinary thing he had ever said to me or the final straw in a pile that had been swaying for years. I passed the bread. I kept my face still, and something small and cold and absolutely determined had already begun, deep below the surface, to decide what came next. The spring was opening windows all over Baltimore that night. It was opening something in me, too. The first time I noticed something wrong with our finances, Raymond told me I had misread the statement. He was patient about it, more than patient. He was gentle in the particular way of someone who has decided their judgment is simply superior to yours and is doing you a kindness by taking the time to explain it. We were sitting at the kitchen table, not the kitchenette I live in now, but the old kitchen in the house we shared for 32 years, the one with the faucet that ran cold for a full minute before the hot water arrived. And he showed me, carefully and unhurriedly, where I had gotten confused. 2 different accounts, 2 different time periods, an insurance payment I had failed to account for. He folded the paper in half when he finished explaining, and took it with him when he left the room. I believed him, not because I lacked intelligence, because loyalty was the language I had been living inside my entire adult life. The kind of loyalty that will sacrifice its own judgment before it will see something it doesn't want to see. I had spent 48 years prioritizing family unity above my own well-being, and I had done it so completely, so consistently, that I had stopped knowing how to distinguish between love and erasure. When Raymond made financial decisions without consulting me, I called it his leadership. When he moved money without explanation, I called it trust. When he corrected my understanding of our shared finances with patient, careful detail, I told myself it was evidence of his greater experience with such things. I had been translating his errors into my inadequacies for so long that I could no longer tell which was which. I want to speak directly to you for a moment. If something in what I just described just tightened in your chest, if you recognize the specific shape of that quiet, recurring erasure dressed up as helpfulness, I want you to know that recognition is not a coincidence. It is not your imagination. That recognition is a part of you that has been waiting to have that pattern named out loud. The gaslighting was never one dramatic lie. It was 100 small corrections, delivered with patience, delivered with kindness, each one individually reasonable, each one arriving with the tone of a person who only wants you to have accurate information. You do not lose your grip on reality all at once. You loosen it one reasonable conversation at a time until the day you look at a bank statement and your first thought is not something is wrong here, but I am probably misunderstanding this again. That is the sophistication of what Raymond had done over decades. He had turned my own judgment against me so gradually that I had become my own first line of defense against my own clarity. I had been managing myself on his behalf without knowing it. The sacrifice I made was my boundaries. Not money first, that loss came later, downstream of the first and deepest loss, which was the surrender of my own no. I forgave endlessly and without limit. I never refused. Every confrontation I avoided was a wall going up on his side that I could not see from mine. Every time I should have said no and chose silence instead, I told myself it was generosity. I had confused compliance with grace for so long that I had forgotten they were different things entirely. There had been a time when I baked sweet potato pie every Sunday morning, not from a card. This recipe lived in my hands the way some knowledge lives in the body rather than the mind. The proportion of butter, the shade the filling turns when it is ready, the way the cinnamon scent moves through the kitchen before the pie is even done, arriving ahead of itself like an announcement. My grandmother made this pie for celebrations and for grief and for ordinary Sundays that deserved to be marked. I had inherited it as a language. For years it was the ritual that tethered me to myself when everything else felt like it belonged to someone else's story. I had stopped baking it as often. I told myself it was about watching my health. The truth I can only say plainly now is that joy becomes difficult to hold when someone spends years gently correcting your understanding of things. You begin, slowly, without deciding to let go of the things you love. The rituals that once felt like home begin to feel too fragile for the weight of the life surrounding them. Most Sundays I made do with chicken frying in a cast-iron skillet. Just the familiar sound of it, the hiss and spit of fat and iron, filling my small studio the way voices once filled a house. I had learned to accept smaller and smaller versions of comfort, and I had named that acceptance wisdom. The hymnal from my mother's funeral sat on my nightstand, worn soft at the spine from years of being held. I had never found a reason to put it away. It was not entirely about faith, not in the formal sense. It was about her hands having touched it, about the fact that something she had carried still existed when she did not. On the nights when the stone in my chest felt heaviest, I would hold it the way other people hold something they cannot explain but cannot release. Just the weight of it. Just the reminder that I had come from someone, that someone had known my name before it was anyone else's. The seeds of what was coming were already in the ground for months. I simply was not yet willing to look at what was growing. The night of March 14th, 2024. I was sitting on the edge of my bed at 11 in the evening with the hymnal in my lap, and the lights turned low, doing the thing I had been doing for months, running the numbers in my head. Not concrete figures, which I could no longer access easily. The emotional arithmetic of a marriage that had become something else. What I had put in versus what had come back. What had been taken without my name on the transaction. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Raymond. Not unusual, but the time was wrong, and my body registered that before I picked it up. That animal alertness that lives below reason, below loyalty, below 48 years of choosing to believe. My hand already knew something. I read it once, then I read it again. She still doesn't know about the second account. Keep her talking about the grandkids. I was she. The woman being monitored. The woman whose awareness needed to be managed. Raymond and Marcus, my husband and my son, had been tracking what I knew and what I didn't know. Directing my attention, redirecting my questions, sustaining a deliberate, coordinated effort to keep me ignorant of a financial arrangement that was, by every legal standard, mine to know about. He had typed my contact name by mistake, a small human error, the kind that cannot be recalled once the screen has gone dark. A second account. I stood up from the bed without deciding to stand. My body simply refused stillness. I walked to the bathroom and turned on the light, and I stood at the mirror the way you stand before something you have been carefully avoiding. The woman looking back at me was 74 years old and hollowed out. Not broken, something past breaking, something that had been quietly emptied over years until the shape of her was still standing, but nothing inside was what it had been. The lines around her mouth were from decades of swallowed words. The set of her jaw was from years of holding it closed. Her golden mustard sweater had slipped off one shoulder, where she had been clutching herself without knowing. The same grip she made under dinner tables, in parked cars, in every moment when the truth was pushing against the surface and she was holding it down by force of long habit. I pressed both palms flat against the cold edge of the sink and breathed. Once, twice. The porcelain was cold and specific, and I needed something that specific, something I could not explain away. I want you to understand what that mirror moment actually was, because it did not feel like what you might imagine. It did not feel like despair. It felt like the end of a story. The story I had been telling myself, that I was probably overreacting, that the missing money was probably a misunderstanding, that the man I had married was probably making understandable if occasionally careless decisions. That story was over. The text on my phone had closed its final chapter, and I was standing at the sink in my studio knowing exactly where I was. A conspiracy. Not the dramatic word, the accurate one. Multiple family members working in coordinated, sustained deliberation to move money from accounts that bore my name, counting on my loyalty, my silence, my trained incapacity to say no. They had been managing me. For how long I did not yet fully know. But I was going to find out. I walked back into the main room. My eyes went to the rotary phone on the wall without my meaning for them to. It registered differently that night. Not the comfort of something familiar and sturdy, but something I was going to need. Something I had kept when I surrendered so much else. Raymond had spent years telling me it was embarrassing to hold on to it. He had been wrong about what was worth keeping for a long time. He had been wrong about the phone, too. I sat on the bed. I took the hymnal in both hands and held it until my hands stopped shaking. 5 minutes, maybe less. Then they were still. Then I picked up the phone and looked at the text again, and this time I did not read it with a breaking heart. I read it as evidence, a timestamp, a name attached to a lie, something concrete that had arrived in my hands not because I had been clever enough, but because Raymond had made the one mistake he had never made in 48 years. He had underestimated me so completely that he had stopped being careful. The $63,000 missing from our joint accounts since the previous spring had not been insurance payments, not accounting adjustments, not the complex financial maneuvers Raymond had patiently explained to me with the gentle tone of a man correcting someone who cannot follow complicated information. It had been taken, deliberately, by two people who had made a decision together about money that was mine. They had made one mistake. He had typed the wrong name. And now I knew exactly what I was working with. I called her at midnight. Not from strategy. From instinct. The way you reach in a dark room for the one lamp you know is still on. I scrolled through my phone with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. And when I reached Destiny's name, my thumb stopped. She is 23 years old. My granddaughter, Marcus's daughter. The one member of this family who had always looked at me the way you look at someone when you actually see them. Not the role, not the function, not the grandmother at the head of the holiday table, but the actual person behind all of that. Destiny had always talked to me as if what I said carried weight, as if my opinions were worth receiving rather than managing. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was awake. I told her everything without performance. The text, the second account, the $63,000 I had been quietly tracking for months, watching move through joint statements I was not supposed to understand. The dinner 2 weeks earlier where Raymond had told Marcus, in front of guests, that I had never understood money. My voice was steadier than I had any right to expect, steadier than a woman alone at midnight in a studio with a hollow reflection in her bathroom mirror had any business being. Perhaps the shaking had already been through me. Perhaps what lives on the other side of the very last illusion is simply very still, very cold, and completely ready. Destiny was quiet for several seconds when I finished. Then she said, "Grandma, I need to come over." She was at my door by 12:40. She sat down at my kitchenette table without taking off her jacket, the way you sit when you have come prepared to stay through something hard. She placed her phone face up on the table between us. In the kitchen light, with the studio quiet and the Baltimore night still outside, she looked at me with an expression I need to try to describe accurately. Because it was not pity, and it was not surprise. It was the face of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation and has been preparing herself to have it honestly. "I've been watching this for 2 years," she said. "I saved everything. I want to speak directly to everyone listening right now who has ever been told that young people don't understand family loyalty, can't appreciate what it costs to hold a family together, don't have the experience to see the full picture. Sometimes the person who sees most clearly is precisely the one who hasn't yet been taught to look away." Destiny had watched things in this family for 2 years that every adult around her had chosen not to acknowledge, and she had saved every piece of it quietly and without telling anyone, because she had been waiting for me to be ready to receive the truth. That is what love actually looks like. not managing someone's awareness for their own protection, staying awake while they sleep, keeping the evidence safe, waiting for the moment they can bear it. She showed me the screenshots first. Text chains between Raymond and Marcus going back to February 2022. Over 2 years of coordinated communication about account movements, about what to tell me when I asked questions, about how to redirect my attention when it turned toward the figures. In one exchange from the previous summer, Marcus had asked whether to involve their attorney. Raymond had written back, "Not yet. Keep it quiet until the paperwork is done." The paperwork. Destiny scrolled to the email thread next. It had found its way to her through a shared family device Marcus had been careless with, and it showed the movement of the $63,000 in 3 separate transfers, each one bearing both Raymond's and Marcus's names in the transaction confirmations. Not an error, not a miscommunication. Transactions that 2 people had executed together, deliberately, more than once, over more than a year, involving money that carried my name. Then she played the voicemail. She had recorded it herself at Christmas dinner, standing close enough to the back hallway when Raymond stepped in to take a call. His voice was low, but the recording was clear. "Keep Grandma occupied. I need about 40 minutes. A pause. "She's been asking about the June transfer. Just make sure she's talking about the kids when I come back in. Keep Grandma occupied. I am going to tell you exactly what happened in my body when I heard that sentence played in my own kitchen at 1 a.m. The stone in my chest, the one that had been growing since January, made heavier by every patient explanation and every corrected statement, and every dinner where I smiled and passed the bread, did not grow heavier. It dissolved. It was replaced by something I had not felt in a very long time. Clarity. Cold, focused, absolute clarity. The kind that lives on the other side of the very last lie you are willing to believe. I was done grieving. There was nothing left to grieve. There was only what needed to be done. I looked at Destiny across the small table at 1 a.m. and thought of the legal aid attorney's number tucked inside the back cover of my mother's hymnal, the flyer I had picked up at the senior center months ago and told myself I would probably never need. I had been wrong about a great many things. I was finished being wrong. "How long can you stay?" I asked her. She reached back and pulled off her jacket and draped it over the chair. "As long as you need," she said. A woman who has been made to feel like nothing becomes the most formidable person in the room the moment she knows exactly what was done to her and holds the documents to prove it. Raymond had counted on my silence. He had no plan for my precision. 6 weeks. That is how long it took us to build the case without Raymond suspecting anything had changed. 6 weeks of passing the bread. 6 weeks of answering his calls in the same warm, measured tone I had always used. 6 weeks of keeping my face calm while a completely different life was being assembled behind it. I want you to understand what that kind of sustained performance actually costs. Because it is not simple, and it is not strength exactly. It is the discipline of a woman who has spent decades living on 2 simultaneous planes. The surface plane where everything is routine and nothing is wrong. And the deeper plane, cold and purposeful, and completely deliberate, running beneath all of it, where Destiny and I met twice a week at my kitchenette table and built something Raymond could not reach. I called Phyllis on a Thursday morning, the legal aid attorney whose number I had kept tucked inside the hymnal for months, telling myself I would never need it. She was direct in a way I found immediately settling. She asked me questions that assumed I was intelligent. After years of having my perceptions gently corrected and my financial understanding quietly dismissed, a person who simply listened and waited for your full answer before responding was a remarkable thing to encounter. We reviewed the power of attorney I had signed in 2019. Raymond had walked me through that signing on a Saturday afternoon and told me it was routine estate planning. Standard language, nothing I needed to read too closely. "Very dry stuff," he had said. "You'll only confuse yourself." And I had not questioned it, because questioning was not a practice I had cultivated inside this marriage. What the document actually said was that I held power of attorney over our joint accounts, with the legal right to access, freeze, and control every account to which my name was attached, under specific circumstances that Phyllis confirmed I qualified for under current conditions. I had signed those rights into existence 5 years earlier, under a signature Raymond had witnessed, under the impression that it protected him. He had not anticipated that I would ever read it carefully enough to understand that it worked in both directions with equal legal force. Are you hearing what I am saying? The very document he had stood over me to sign, the one he discouraged me from reading, the one he reassured me was irrelevant in any practical sense, was the same document that was going to dismantle everything he had built behind my back. Some things are worth holding on to even when you do not yet understand why you are holding them. Over 6 weeks, Destiny and I compiled everything. Joint account statements going back 4 years, property records, the screenshots she had saved, the email thread, the voicemail, every piece organized by date, by account number, by the names attached to each transaction. We made 2 complete copies, one digital, encrypted on a drive Destiny kept at her apartment, and one full paper copy sealed in an envelope mailed directly to Phyllis as formal documentation. I was not building a record of feelings, I was building evidence. Facts with dates and numbers and specific names, organized with the kind of clarity that leaves no room to be explained away by a patient man with a gentle correcting tone. Then came the day I went to the bank. I told Raymond I was going to the pharmacy. I parked 2 blocks from the branch on a side street and walked in through the glass doors on a Tuesday morning in late March. I sat down across from a teller and said the words I had been composing in my mind for weeks. I would like to open a new account. Just my name, no one else's. She smiled and started typing, and I sat in that plastic chair and felt something I want to describe precisely because the word liberation is both exactly right and insufficient for the particular quality of what it was. It was liberation in its most specific physical form, the sensation of a decision made entirely on my own behalf, without permission, without negotiation, without a voice in my ear assessing whether it was necessary or premature, or something we should discuss together first. My income, directed to an account Raymond could not access, could not monitor, could not redirect. My name, and only my name, on the card that came across the desk a few minutes later. I put the card in my wallet beneath the photograph of Destiny I kept there, right behind her face. I walked back to my car and sat in the spring morning light for a moment. Not the frozen sitting of Marcus's driveway, not the paralyzed waiting of a woman holding herself still and trying not to know what she already knew. This was entirely different. This was a woman who had just taken the first solid piece of her life back into her own hands, the first dollars of a fortune that would be built on her own terms. The close call came 3 days later. I had set Phyllis's business card on the counter for 30 seconds while I transferred her number to my phone, and Raymond came in from the hallway earlier than expected. I swept the card under the dish towel without looking up. He went to the refrigerator, poured juice, said something about the weather. My heart was pressing against my ribs. I said something back about the weather. I handed him his glass with a steady hand. After he left the room, I stood completely still for 30 seconds. Then I picked up Phyllis's card and tucked it back inside the hymnal behind my mother's photograph. My hands were steady. The trap was nearly ready. The email took me 3 days to write. Not because I was uncertain about what to say. I had known exactly what needed to be said for weeks, had been composing it in the back of my mind before I let myself acknowledge that was what I was doing. But because there is a fundamental difference between an outburst and a reckoning. An outburst is emotion looking for release. A reckoning has attachments. Phyllis had walked me through everything. The frozen accounts, the legal rights under the power of attorney, the process for executing them. She had also been honest about what I needed to hear, that formal legal processes move slowly in complicated family financial cases, that courts take time, that months can become years. The law is real, she told me, but so is your community. Said simply, said once. I received it. I was clear-eyed about what I was preparing to do. This email was not only a legal action, it was a public act, a deliberate choice about visibility, about who would know and what they would know, and who would have to decide where they stood. I had spent 48 years managing my own visibility downward, making myself small and quiet so as not to inconvenience anyone, performing smallness so consistently it had become the shape others saw when they looked at me. This was the last time I would ever make that choice in that direction. The recipient list held 14 names: Raymond, Marcus, Reverend Coleman, who had known us both since before our children were born, who had shaken my hand in the church doorway every Sunday for 20 years, 3 deacons, 3 neighbors from the old block, several others who formed the architecture of Raymond's social standing, the people whose opinions he had carefully cultivated, in front of whom he had performed his version of our marriage and his version of me. The witnesses to my silence, the people who deserved to understand what that silence had been protecting. I thought about this carefully, about whether it was cruelty or accountability. The conclusion was simple. The difference between them is intention. I was not sending this to wound Raymond. I was sending it because the people who had watched me be small for years deserved to know why, and because community accountability moves faster than any court I had ever encountered. Earlier that week, Raymond had come to pick me up from the senior center. I was at the window when he pulled in, and I watched him arrive in the Audi A8, graphite gray, purchased 18 months ago without any discussion with me, explained as a business necessity, paid for with income from the second account, as I now knew precisely. He sat behind the wheel with his hands easy in his lap. His face settled into the expression of a man whose arrangements have been made, whose world is exactly as he has designed it, who has no reason to imagine that anything is about to shift. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man sitting inside a fortune he had assembled carefully using someone else's trust as the primary material. I watched him through the window for 30 seconds. I felt nothing resembling anger. What I felt was the final, quiet, permanent settling of a decision already made. This was going to happen. Everything was in order. Destiny and I assembled the final email over 2 evenings at the kitchenette table. Screenshots labeled by date and account number. The email thread showing the 3 transfers attached as a PDF, each page marked with both names on the confirmation records. The Christmas voicemail transcribed by Phyllis as a signed document. Every piece referenced in the body of the email with a corresponding attachment number, organized with the precision you bring to something meant to endure. I drafted the body myself, over 2 sittings. I kept it factual. Dates, account numbers, transfer amounts, names attached to each transaction, the text message, reproduced in full with its timestamp, the power of attorney cited specifically, the accounts covered, the date I had exercised it. No emotional language that could be dismissed as irrational. No appeals for sympathy. Just what happened, when it happened, and who was responsible. Near the bottom, I included the line that had arrived one morning without my searching for it. You said I never understood money. I understood it well enough to lock every account you thought was yours by 10 p.m. last night. And near the top, just after the fax, the rotary phone you always called embarrassing? It's the one I used to call my attorney. Destiny put her hand over mine when I finished and did not say anything, because nothing needed to be said. I looked at my hands on the table, the hands that had held a hymnal through 50 years of Sundays, that had kneaded sweet potato filling from a recipe that lived in muscle memory, that had gripped a golden mustard sweater beneath a dinner table while a man dismissed me to our son. And I felt them as mine. Completely, solidly, finally mine. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. When everyone's phones were active and the day had just begun. April 2nd, 2024, 9:04 in the morning. I was at my kitchenette table. The spring light came through the east window the way it always did at that hour. Clean, unhurried, lying across the counter where my tea had cooled to exactly the right temperature. The studio was quiet. The shared hallway outside was quiet. I was wearing my golden mustard sweater. I had chosen it deliberately. I wanted to be wearing what I had been wearing the night Raymond dismissed me at that dinner table when the morning arrived, that he could not dismiss me anymore. I opened the email on my laptop. I had read it 4 times since Wednesday. I knew every word, every attachment, what each document proved. I read the recipient list one final time. Raymond, Marcus, Reverend Coleman, the deacons, the neighbors. 14 people who had held the audience for the story Raymond had been telling about me, accommodating, confused, incapable of understanding what mattered. 14 people who were about to receive a different version, told not by Raymond's voice but by account numbers and timestamps, and a recording made in a back hallway on Christmas evening. I let myself think for one moment about his voice at that dinner table. The flatness of it, the certainty. "Your mother never understood money," said to our son. Said without a single glance in my direction, because 48 years of my silence had taught him that my silence was permanent, that it was structural, that it was simply who I was. He had never once considered that it might be a decision I could stop making. I clicked send. The room did not change. There was no dramatic sound. Just the small, barely audible electronic swish of an email leaving my screen and arriving in 14 inboxes on a spring Wednesday morning in Baltimore. I sat with that sound for a moment, the most powerful thing I had done in 48 years, and it was quieter than a breath. Raymond called at 9:17. I let it ring. He called again at 9:22. At 9:28, a text arrived. "What did you do?" I set the phone face down on the table and drank my tea. Marcus called at 9:31. I did not answer. I want to tell you what happened next because the precision of it was something approaching extraordinary. Reverend Coleman had read the email before 10 o'clock that morning. He had opened every attachment. He had looked at the account numbers, the transfer records, the names on the confirmation lines. He called Raymond not to offer comfort. He called to ask him, formally, not to return to the congregation until further notice. Reverend Coleman, the man Raymond had shaken hands with in that church doorway every Sunday for 20 years. The handshake that announced his standing, that confirmed his place in the community he had cultivated with such careful attention. Gone. Before 10 on a Wednesday morning in spring. I want to speak directly to every woman listening right now who has been told she will tear her family apart if she tells the truth. Every woman who has held her silence because she was afraid of what speaking would cost her. Listen carefully. They were already tearing it apart. They built the destruction. You were simply the one left standing in the wreckage, holding the truth in both hands, being blamed for the debris. Speaking the truth is not the betrayal. The betrayal is what was done to you in the silence. Marcus came to my door at 11:15. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, slower than usual, and then his voice, low and tight, saying my name once, then twice, then, "Mom, please." I stood on the other side of that door with one hand resting lightly against the frame, and I felt something I had not anticipated. Not triumph, not cruelty, not even anger, which had left me so completely that its absence was its own kind of revelation. I felt nothing. Complete, settled, genuine nothing. And that nothing was a relief so total and so physical that I had to put one hand on the wall to steady myself. Not from weakness, but from the sheer force of being free of something that had lived inside my chest for years. I told him through the door, Everything I had to say is in the email, Marcus. I would suggest reading it again. He left. I want you to hear these 2 lines one more time, because I want them to belong to every woman who has ever been dismissed at her own table. You said I never understood money. I understood it well enough to lock every account you thought was yours by 10 p.m. last night. The rotary phone you always called embarrassing? It's the one I used to call my attorney. He had dismissed every part of me, one small piece at a time, for 48 years. The phone, my comprehension of numbers, my capacity to read a document and understand it, my name on a legal record he had encouraged me to forget. He had done it with patience and gentleness and the absolute certainty of a man who had never once asked himself whether I might be paying attention. I had been paying attention. I had been paying attention the entire time. The tea was the right temperature. The spring light lay across my counter. I sat in my golden mustard sweater at my kitchenette table with the phone face down, and I felt, for the first time in years, like exactly the person I had always been. The weeks that followed were not what I had prepared for, and I had believed I had prepared for everything. Raymond's anger was predictable. I had anticipated it, and managed it at a distance through formal legal channels and through Phyllis, who served as the communication point while I kept my daily life with extraordinary calm. I was not hiding anymore. I was finished. There is a profound difference between those 2 postures. One comes from fear, the other comes from completion. Marcus's silence arrived quickly and completely, the way silence arrives from someone who has been caught with their hands in something indefensible, and understands that explanation would only extend the exposure. I had grieved the version of Marcus I had raised for 30 years. That grief was private and I gave it its proper space. But I was not going to let grief become a reason to unsee what I had seen. That particular confusion, the one where we mistake grief for doubt, was over. What I had not anticipated was the speed of community. By the end of the first week, Reverend Coleman had spoken to the deacons. By that Friday, 2 women who had been in that congregation longer than either Raymond or I had reached out to me separately, without being asked, to say that what they had read in the email had not surprised them, and to say they were sorry it had taken this long for them to know the full shape of it. They were not apologizing for Raymond. They were acknowledging their own years of polite silence while something had been happening in plain sight, and naming that acknowledgement honestly. I received those words for what they were. Raymond lost access to $91,000 in joint funds, frozen under the power of attorney and pending legal review. His name on those accounts was no longer a door he could walk through without my authorization. The formal legal process was ongoing, slowly, deliberately, with Phyllis's regular updates. But the freezing was immediate and real, and Raymond knew it. Marcus lost something harder to quantify but more permanent: the quiet, assumed complicity of the neighborhood. The people on that quiet suburban street with modest homes and chain-link fences who had watched me be small for years now held documents in their hands that explained why. Community accountability moves considerably faster than any court. The graphite gray Audi sat in Marcus's driveway for 2 weeks while Raymond stayed there, calling occasionally and receiving no response from me. Then it was gone. I do not know where he went. I did not ask. The most complete freedom I have experienced is the complete absence of needing to know. My new tribe assembled itself quietly, without ceremony, at my kitchenette table. Destiny came on Thursday evenings. We would eat and talk about things entirely separate from Raymond, her life, her plans, her future. The stories I had never told anyone about the woman I had been before I learned to make myself invisible. I told her about her grandfather, the man who had known my name before it was Raymond's wife. She listened with the attentive, steady quality of someone who understands that old stories carry weight worth receiving. Phyllis joined us one Thursday in May. She had been checking in on me every week since April, without being asked, because she is the kind of person who does not distinguish between professional obligation and genuine care. 2 women from the senior center followed, Patricia and Gloria, who had recognized the shape of my story inside their own when I had spoken briefly at a meeting. A circle without a charter, without a formal name, without any purpose beyond the warmth of people who had found each other in honesty and stayed. Not blood, choice. And chosen family, I have learned, is more solid than any table you inherited from someone who never valued your seat at it. On a Saturday morning in late April, I drove to the old neighborhood. Not the quiet suburban street where I now lived, but the streets where I grew up. Where I had been before I knew Raymond, before I learned to make myself small for anyone. Women I had known since childhood still lived there, 3 of them within 4 blocks of the school we had all attended. I parked and knocked on doors and was welcomed in the only way that people who knew you before you learned to disappear can welcome you. With the complete, uncomplicated recognition of someone who remembers your actual name. They made coffee. They asked how I was doing, not how the family was, how I was. That evening, coming back into my studio, I stopped in the doorway and looked at the rotary phone on the wall, the heavy handset, the precise dial, the ring that belonged to another century. I put my hand on the receiver and let it rest there for a moment. Raymond had called it an embarrassment for years. He had been wrong about what was worth keeping for a long time, and he had been wrong about this too. The phone had been here through all of it. The years I kept it, when I should have kept so much more of myself. The midnight when I called my granddaughter, the morning I called my attorney for the first time. It had been waiting, patiently, doing exactly what it was made to do. Working, without apology, without embarrassment, without ever needing to be told it had a right to be here. I understood it differently now. It was not a relic. It was evidence. Evidence that I had always known, even in the years when I could not act on what I knew. Which parts of myself were worth refusing to surrender? I was still her. I had always been her. I just finally had my whole life to myself to remember it. It is spring again now. A full year has turned and the Baltimore air is coming through my east window again, carrying its smell of cut grass and something beginning, and I am sitting with coffee in the same chair where I sat the morning I sent the email. The same morning light is on the same counter. I can feel all of it this year. Every molecule of this season, received fully, without the glass I had been living behind for so long. Last spring, I sat frozen in a driveway for 21 minutes, unable to feel anything. This spring, I am entirely, solidly here. The legal process continues in the way legal processes do, deliberately, with paperwork, with Phyllis's regular updates that I have learned to receive with patience instead of urgency. The $91 in frozen accounts is in formal review and will eventually produce an outcome I will be informed of. I have stopped organizing my days around when that outcome arrives. I have a life to live while institutions process their paperwork, and I have learned not to put living on hold while waiting for external resolution. Raymond has not contacted me since May. I do not track his circumstances closely. I know the Audi is gone. I know his standing in the congregation has changed in ways that are not reversible. I know Marcus has been quiet in every direction. What I feel toward them is something I want to name accurately, because it is not what you might expect. It is not satisfaction. Satisfaction requires continued investment in the other person's downfall, and I have disengaged completely. What I feel is indifference. Complete, genuine, permanent indifference. I do not need Raymond's punishment in order to feel whole. My wholeness is entirely separate from whatever is happening to him. The internal freedom, the complete settled silence where his voice used to live in my head, That is the real victory. Not the email, not the frozen accounts, not Reverend Coleman's call. The peace. The freedom from needing anything from Raymond in order to feel at peace with my own life. On Sunday mornings, I bake sweet potato pie again. Made it for the Thursday group last week. Patricia asked for the recipe, and I told her it was not written down, which is true. It lives in the hands, not on a card. She said she would come early next Thursday and learn it by watching. I told her that was the only way to receive it properly. Last week, I drove past a dealership on my way home from the old neighborhood. They had a dark gray sedan in the lot. I slowed down and looked at it as I passed. Someday I will drive an Audi A8 in graphite gray. Not to prove anything to anyone, not as a statement, because it will be mine, purchased with income from an account that carries only my name, signed by the hand that signed those legal papers, owned by the woman who understood money exactly as well as she always did, whether she was ever given credit for it or not. That is what wealth means when it is genuinely yours, not net worth as a display of standing, not dollars spent to announce your value to people who never acknowledged it. Just the clean, specific freedom of your own name on your own account, your own decisions, your own fortune built entirely on your own terms. Now I want to talk directly to you about what I learned, about what I wish someone had told me. When the system fails, when legal processes move too slowly, when family closes ranks, when the people who are supposed to protect you look away because there is no visible wound to point to, the instinct is to wait. To wait for someone with formal authority to see what you see and do the work for you. I understand that instinct. I felt it. I am asking you from the other side of it to resist it. The most powerful tool available to anyone in a situation like mine is documentation you build yourself. Screenshot everything. Forward emails to a private account they do not have access to. Print paper copies and store them somewhere only you can reach. Record dates, amounts, names, specific language. Not because institutions will always act quickly, often they will not. But because documentation changes what you are able to do for yourself. It gives you options. It gives you leverage. It gives your truth something to stand on that does not require anyone to simply take your word for it. And it gives the people around you something concrete to respond to, because community moves faster than any courtroom. There is something else that needs to be said plainly, because it deserves to be said. American research shows that 64% of adults have had at least one traumatic childhood experience. 64%. That is not an exception or an edge case. That is most of us sitting in this conversation right now. Many of us learned, inside those early families, to make ourselves smaller than we were, to prioritize the group's peace over our own truth, to call compliance love, to forgive reflexively what deserved instead to be refused. That learning does not stop at the boundary of childhood. It follows us into marriages and into families and into kitchens where we make ourselves comfortable in smaller and smaller spaces and name the shrinking maturity. And this pattern belongs to no single culture or country. Studies indicate that in Mexico, 1 in 3 seniors suffers some form of mistreatment. 1 in 3. The same silence, the same learned smallness, the same mechanism of control dressed in the clothes of family loyalty. These numbers cross every language and every border. What sustains them is silence. What ends them is documentation, and the courage to let the truth be seen by the people with the power to respond to it. I am 74 years old. I bake sweet potato pie on Sunday mornings from my grandmother's recipe. I meet my Thursday group at my kitchen table. I drive to the old neighborhood and knock on doors and am welcomed in by women who knew me before I learned to disappear. I hold my mother's hymnal on the nights I need to remember where I came from. I answer the rotary phone when it rings. I feel no shame about any of it. Before you go, where are you listening from? I genuinely want to know. Drop your city or your state in the comments. I read every single one. And I want to ask you something honest. What would you have done? At that dinner table, with that text message on your phone, with 48 years of silence behind you and 63,000 missing dollars in your chest? What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. That conversation matters to me. If this story said something you have needed to hear for a long time, click like. It helps more people find their way here. And if you want to stay, if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and come back. There is always more to tell. There are always more women who sat in parked cars in the dark and decided, finally, to go inside and change everything. You are not alone in this. You never were,